Some people wear power like a tailored suit, but the strongest ones never need to announce who they are. Grace Bennett's measuring tape slipped between her fingers as the little brass bell above the front door rang for the sixth time that rainy Thursday afternoon. Bennett Tailoring had stood on the same corner in downtown Hartford for nearly 30 years, its front windows displaying handmade suits that most people admired but only a handful could afford. The scent of pressed wool, fresh coffee, and cedarwood filled the narrow shop while jazz drifted softly from an old radio behind the counter. Grace had inherited more than a business from her late father. She had inherited one rule that no amount of money could ever change. Respect walked through the front door before any customer did. Outside, the rain painted silver lines across Main Street as expensive sedans rolled past office workers, rushing beneath umbrellas. Inside, every stitch was measured with patience. Every customer greeted with the same quiet smile, whether they arrived wearing designer shoes or worn-out boots. That afternoon, an elderly veteran waited patiently on a wooden chair while Grace adjusted the sleeve of his only navy blazer before his granddaughter's college graduation. Across the room, a young waitress nervously saved every dollar she could afford for alterations on a second-hand interview suit. Grace treated both garments with identical care because clothing, she believed, carried hope long before it carried status. The bell chimed again. This time a tall man entered wearing a weathered charcoal overcoat darkened by rain. His boots carried road dust, and the collar of his coat hid most of his face beneath the shadow of a black cashmere cap. Nothing about him suggested extraordinary wealth. If anything, he looked like another traveler escaping the storm. He stepped toward the counter without acknowledging the customers who had been waiting first. Before Grace could greet him, two broad-shouldered men in tailored black suits followed through the doorway. They remained silent, but their presence changed the air inside the shop. One of them placed an expensive garment bag on the cutting table and spoke with calm confidence. "Mr. William would like this suit finished tonight." Grace glanced at the garment bag, then at the waiting customers, before returning her attention to the man in the rain-soaked overcoat. "Everyone here arrived before he did," she answered gently. "He'll receive the same service as everyone else." The second man reached into his jacket and carefully placed a thick envelope on the counter. "We can make it worth your while." Grace didn't even look inside. She pushed the envelope back across the polished oak surface with 2 fingers. "Around here," she said, her voice steady enough to quiet the room, "respect isn't something you buy. It's something you practice." For the first time, the stranger lifted his head. His calm blue eyes met hers without anger, without surprise, almost as though he had been searching for exactly those words. Around them, every conversation stopped. Even the old jazz station faded beneath the silence settling over the shop. The veteran lowered his newspaper. The young waitress forgot to check her phone. Rain tapped softly against the front windows while the stranger continued watching Grace with an unreadable expression. One of the suited men took a single step forward as if prepared to argue, but Grace calmly pointed toward the front door. "If your first conversation in my shop begins with cutting in front of everyone else," she said, "then today isn't the day I'll be tailoring your suit." The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm outside. Then, without raising his voice or showing the slightest hint of offense, the man simply reached for the garment bag, nodded once, and turned toward the exit. The brass bell rang softly behind him as he disappeared into the rain, leaving every person inside wondering whether Grace Bennett had just protected her principles or made the biggest mistake of her life. Grace stood motionless for several seconds after the bell stopped ringing, her fingers resting lightly on the worn oak counter as the steady rhythm of rain continued outside. No one spoke. It was the elderly veteran who finally cleared his throat and offered a gentle smile. "Your father would have been proud of that," he said quietly before gathering his blazer. Those simple words carried more weight than any compliment Grace had received in years. She smiled politely, but said nothing. After every customer left, she locked the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and walked toward the faded photograph hanging above the pressing station. It showed her father standing in the very same shop nearly 3 decades earlier, wearing a measuring tape around his neck and smiling beside a handwritten sign that read, "Every suit begins with respect." When Grace was 12 years old, she had watched a wealthy developer throw a custom jacket onto the floor because a button had been sewn with the wrong shade of thread. Her father had calmly picked up the jacket, folded it with care, placed the payment back into the customer's hand, and politely asked him never to return. They had struggled financially for months afterward, but her father never regretted that decision. He often told her that losing money was temporary, but losing self-respect could last forever. Those words had quietly shaped every decision Grace made after inheriting the business. Across town, however, the rainy afternoon unfolded very differently. The black sport utility vehicle carrying the mysterious customer moved silently through downtown traffic. Neither of the suited men dared to speak until several blocks had passed. Finally, the younger one glanced into the rearview mirror. "Sir, should we move our business elsewhere?" The man in the charcoal overcoat continued watching the rain slide across the tinted window before answering. "Did you notice what she protected?" His driver hesitated. "Her schedule." A faint smile touched the corner of the man's mouth. "No, her standards." Silence filled the vehicle once again. Back inside the tailor shop, Grace finished organizing fabric samples before switching off the pressing machine. Her longtime assistant, Linda Foster, walked from the storage room carrying a stack of folded garments. Linda had worked beside Grace for almost 15 years and rarely questioned her judgment, but tonight concern lingered in her eyes. "Grace," she asked, carefully, "do you know who that customer was?" Grace shook her head. "Should I?" Linda inhaled slowly. "A delivery driver from the financial district came by while you were in the back. He recognized one of the men outside. They work for William Castellano." Grace paused with a suit jacket still hanging in her hands. The name meant little to her personally, but she had heard enough stories from local business owners to understand his reputation. He funded hospitals, restored historic buildings, donated anonymously to scholarship programs, and somehow seemed connected to nearly every major business deal in Connecticut. Nobody could fully explain how much influence he possessed, only that people listened whenever he entered a room. Linda lowered her voice. "Some people say you never tell William Castellano no." Grace carefully placed the jacket onto its hanger before turning off the last light above the cutting table. Her expression remained calm. "Then perhaps they have forgotten that every person hears the word no at least once in life." Neither woman noticed the dark sedan parked quietly across the street for several minutes after they left. Its headlights remained off as one man looked through the windshield toward the small tailor shop, studying the modest brick building with the same thoughtful expression he had worn inside only an hour earlier. Grace barely slept that night. It was not fear that kept her awake, but uncertainty. The name William Castellano echoed through her thoughts as rain tapped gently against the windows of her small apartment above the tailor shop. She had built her entire life around one simple belief that every person deserved the same measure of respect regardless of wealth or influence. Yet now she found herself wondering whether that belief would survive its greatest test. Just after sunrise, she unlocked the shop as she always did. The familiar scent of pressed fabric and polished wood greeted her like an old friend. She switched on the display lights, adjusted a navy blue window mannequin, and placed a handwritten sign beside the register that read, "Thank you for supporting local craftsmanship." Routine had always given her peace. Today, however, the streets outside seemed unusually restless. By 8 o'clock, the first customer had not even arrived, but whispers already drifted through the neighborhood. Two women paused outside the front window, pretending to admire a display jacket while quietly glancing toward Grace inside. A delivery driver unloading fresh coffee beans from the cafe next door leaned toward Linda as she swept the sidewalk. "Is it true?" he asked in a low voice. "Did Grace really send William Castellano away?" Linda offered only a polite smile. She had learned years ago that rumors only grew stronger when fed. By 9 o'clock, the story had spread across nearly every small business on Main Street. Some versions claimed Grace had insulted a billionaire. Others insisted she had refused a multi-million-dollar contract. One shop owner hurried across the street, carrying a box of pastries, simply to satisfy his curiosity. "Grace," he said carefully, "if I were you, I would close for a few days." She looked up from marking chalk lines across a gray wool jacket. "Why would I do that?" He shifted uncomfortably. "People like him are not used to hearing no." Grace folded the fabric neatly before answering. "Neither was my father." Somehow he survived. The man forced a nervous laugh, but quickly realized she was completely serious. He wished her luck and quietly returned to his own store. Around noon, Linda noticed something unusual. Business had slowed almost to a stop. Regular customers walked past the windows, but hesitated before coming inside. Fear had a strange way of emptying even the friendliest places. Grace refused to let it change her routine. She continued measuring hems, steaming jackets, and answering every phone call with the same calm voice she had always used. Still, every few minutes her eyes drifted toward the front window without realizing it. Shortly after 1 o'clock, a black luxury sedan rolled slowly down Main Street before disappearing around the corner without stopping. 10 minutes later, another followed. Then another. None of them parked. None of the passengers stepped outside. They simply passed the tailor shop at a measured pace before continuing through. Downtown. Linda noticed them too. "Do you think they are watching us?" she whispered. Grace carefully placed another finished suit inside its protective garment bag before looking through the glass. Maybe they are simply driving through town. Linda wanted to believe that answer. Deep inside, she knew it was unlikely. Across the street, several neighboring business owners quietly gathered near the coffee shop, pretending to discuss the weather while counting every unfamiliar vehicle that entered the block. The atmosphere grew heavier with every passing hour, yet nothing happened. No confrontación, no angry phone calls, no threats, only silence. And somehow, that silence unsettled everyone far more than any argument ever could. By late afternoon, the strange calm hanging over Main Street had become more unsettling than any confrontation Grace could have imagined. Every passing hour without an answer seemed to invite another rumor, another whispered theory, another nervous glance through the tailor shop window. Some business owners quietly moved expensive merchandise away from their storefronts before closing. Others ended their workday early, convinced that something unusual was about to happen before sunrise. Grace noticed every anxious expression, yet she refused to let fear dictate her routine. She completed each alteration with the same careful precision her father had taught her, trimmed loose threads from a charcoal blazer, pressed the lapels of a wedding tuxedo, and personally wrapped every finished garment in crisp protective paper. Shortly before closing, an elderly woman entered carrying a faded tan coat that looked older than the building itself. She apologized repeatedly for interrupting Grace so late in the day and quietly admitted she could only afford a simple repair because she was living on a fixed retirement income. Grace smiled warmly, invited her to sit beside the fitting mirror, and spent nearly 30 minutes carefully reinforcing every worn seam. When the woman reached for her purse, Grace gently closed it and shook her head. "Your coat has already earned another winter," she said softly. "That is payment enough." The woman's eyes filled with gratitude before she thanked Grace and disappeared into the cool evening air. Linda watched the entire exchange without speaking. As she locked the register a few minutes later, she finally asked the question that had lingered all day. "Do you ever wonder if your kindness makes life harder than it has to be?" Grace folded a measuring tape around her neck before answering. "Kindness has never made my life harder. Fear almost always has." Linda nodded slowly, although she was not completely convinced. Outside, the sidewalks emptied as store owners switched off display lights one after another. The tailor shop remained one of the last businesses still glowing warmly against the darkening street. At exactly 6:15, Grace turned the sign to closed and gathered the day's paperwork. Before leaving, she paused beneath the framed photograph of her father once again. She traced the edge of the old wooden frame with her fingertips and remembered something he had once whispered after losing an important customer many years before. "The right people never walk away because you protected your principles. They walk toward them." She smiled faintly at the memory, although she could not explain why those words suddenly felt different tonight. Across the city, inside a quiet executive office overlooking the Hartford skyline, William Castellano removed the rain-soaked overcoat from the previous day and carefully unfolded the garment bag he had carried out of the tailor shop himself. The unfinished suit remained exactly as Grace had returned it, untouched and waiting. One of his senior advisors stood nearby, holding a tablet filled with business schedules. "Tomorrow's meetings begin at 8:30, he said. William never looked up from his suit. Instead, he ran his hand slowly across the fine Italian fabric before asking a completely unexpected question. "How many people work on Main Street before 7 in the morning?" The advisor blinked in confusion. "I'm not certain, sir." William finally lifted his eyes. "Find out." No explanation followed. No discussion about contracts, investments, or the consequences. Only that single request. Meanwhile, several miles away, Grace switched off the apartment lights above the tailor shop and looked down through the bedroom window at the quiet street below. She believed tomorrow would simply bring another ordinary workday. She had no way of knowing that before the first cup of coffee was poured, the entire neighborhood would witness a morning unlike anything Main Street had ever seen. The first rays of morning sunlight had barely reached the rooftops of Main Street when Grace Bennett unlocked the front door of her tailor shop. The cool autumn air carried the familiar aroma of fresh coffee from the cafe next door, and for one peaceful moment, everything felt wonderfully ordinary. She swept the front sidewalk, watered the flower boxes beneath the windows, and arranged 3 completed suits on display exactly as she had done hundreds of mornings before. Yet beneath the quiet rhythm of another workday, the neighborhood carried an unmistakable tension. Curtains shifted inside nearby apartments. Store owners unlocked their doors earlier than usual, pretending to focus on their own businesses while repeatedly glancing toward Bennett Tailoring. Even those who had never spoken to Grace before offered cautious smiles that seemed weighed down by unspoken concern. Linda arrived carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and noticed the unusual silence almost immediately. "They are waiting," she whispered after looking across the street where several shopkeepers had gathered outside the bakery. Grace accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. "Waiting for what?" Linda hesitated. "For something that may never happen." Grace looked out through the spotless front window. "Then perhaps they are wasting a beautiful morning." She disappeared into the fitting room to prepare the day's appointments, refusing to surrender another minute to rumors. At 7:15, the first customer canceled by telephone, apologizing that she needed to reschedule. 5 minutes later, another called with a similar excuse. By 7:30, the appointment book that had been nearly full the night before suddenly contained more empty spaces than names. Grace quietly closed the book without complaint. She understood that fear often convinced good people to make cautious decisions. She simply hoped they would return once the uncertainty faded. Outside, the sidewalks slowly filled with office workers beginning their commute. Some paused long enough to whisper with neighbors. Others slowed their pace only to continue walking after stealing a curious glance toward the tailor shop. The entire block seemed suspended between expectation and ordinary life. Then, at exactly 7:42, a distant line of dark sport utility vehicles appeared at the far end of Main Street. They moved at a calm, measured pace, polished black paint reflecting the pale morning sun. One by one, they turned onto the narrow street without sounding a horn or attracting attention through noise alone. There were no flashing lights, no hurried movements, only quiet precision. Conversations stopped almost instantly. A barista froze while carrying cups onto the sidewalk cafe. A mail carrier lowered his delivery bag without taking another step. The bakery owner removed her apron and walked outside, unable to look away. Grace noticed the silence before she noticed the vehicles. She stepped toward the front window, her expression composed, as the first sport utility vehicle came to a smooth stop directly across from her shop. Then another parked behind it. Then another. Within moments, nearly the entire curb had filled with identical black vehicles stretching farther than she could comfortably count through the glass. No doors opened. No engines rev. No voices echoed through the street. The neighborhood stood perfectly still beneath the crisp morning sky, while every pair of eyes remained fixed on the motionless line of vehicles. Grace drew one slow breath, straightened the measuring tape resting around her neck, and quietly unlocked the front door once again, choosing to greet whatever came next with exactly the same dignity she had shown every customer who had ever crossed her threshold. For several long seconds, nothing happened. The line of black sport utility vehicles remained perfectly still beneath the clear morning sky, while dozens of curious faces watched from sidewalks, storefronts, and second-floor windows. The silence itself seemed to slow time. Grace stood just inside the open doorway of her tailor shop with one hand resting lightly against the polished wood frame. Her heartbeat remained steady, not because she felt fearless, but because she had already decided that fear would not choose her next words or actions. Then, almost at the same instant, every driver's door opened with quiet precision. Men dressed in perfectly tailored black suits stepped onto the pavement, not hurriedly, not aggressively, but with calm professionalism. Instead of surrounding the building, each man walked toward the rear of his vehicle and carefully lifted out a single garment bag. The sight immediately confused everyone watching. There are no briefcases, no cameras, no legal documents, and no raised voices. Only garment bags, one after another, carried with remarkable care as though each contained something priceless. Murmurs spread across Main Street. The bakery owner looked at the pharmacist beside her and whispered, "Those are suits." The pharmacist nodded slowly, unable to explain what he was seeing. Across the street, Linda quietly counted under her breath. 10 garment bags. 15. 20. She stopped counting after 30 because more continued appearing from the remaining vehicles. Grace watched silently, her expression unchanged, although she could not hide the question forming in her eyes. Finally, the rear door of the first vehicle opened. William Castellano stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a navy blue overcoat that fit with understated elegance. There was nothing theatrical about his entrance. No one announced his arrival. He simply adjusted one sleeve, looked toward the tailor shop, and began walking at an unhurried pace. Every suited employee waited respectfully behind him, each still holding a garment bag without moving another step. When William reached the entrance, he removed a pair of brown leather gloves and offered Grace a polite nod that carried neither resentment nor superiority. "Good morning, Miss Bennett," he said with the same calm voice she remembered from the previous afternoon. "Good morning," Grace answered just as evenly. Neither smiled. Neither looked away. The entire street seemed to disappear around them. William glanced briefly toward the garment bags lining the sidewalk before returning his attention to Grace. "Yesterday," he said, "you reminded every person in this neighborhood that rules mean very little if they disappear the moment someone powerful arrives." Grace remained silent, waiting for him to continue. William slowly reached into his coat pocket and removed the same envelope that had been placed on her counter the day before. Without opening it, he placed it back into his own pocket. "You returned my money before you knew my name," he continued. "That is becoming increasingly rare." Grace folded her hands calmly in front of her. "Everyone deserves to wait their turn." William nodded once. "I agree." He then turned slightly toward the line of employees behind him and gave a simple instruction. "Bring them in." One by one, the men carrying garment bags entered the tailor shop with quiet respect, carefully arranging dozens of custom suits across fitting tables, display racks, and every available surface without disturbing a single thread or pin. No one spoke above a whisper. The shop that had struggled to fill its appointment book only an hour earlier suddenly held more handcrafted work than many tailoring businesses completed in an entire year, and every person standing outside realized they had misunderstood the purpose of William Castellano's visit from the very beginning. Grace looked across the rows of garment bags covering nearly every table in her modest shop, then back at William Castellano with quiet disbelief. She had expected questions, criticism, or perhaps a difficult conversation. She had not expected trust measured in dozens of unfinished suits. Linda stood frozen beside the pressing station, carefully counting each numbered tag attached to the garments before finally giving up. There were simply too many. Outside, the crowd along Main Street continued growing as word spread that something extraordinary was unfolding inside Bennett Tailoring. Yet no one heard shouting. No one witnessed an argument. Instead, they saw William remove his overcoat, drape it neatly across the back of a chair, and walk slowly toward the large cutting table where Grace usually measured every new commission. He rested one hand gently on the smooth wooden surface that had carried 3 generations of careful craftsmanship. "Before we discuss business," he said, "I have one question." Grace met his eyes without hesitation. "Go ahead." William glanced toward the shop window, where curious faces watched from the sidewalk before returning his attention to her. "If another man walked through that door this morning wearing old boots, an inexpensive coat, and no appointment, would your answer be any different than it was yesterday?" The room became completely still. Linda looked toward Grace. Even William's own employees quietly waited for her response. Grace did not answer immediately because she believed important questions deserved honest reflection instead of quick words. After a long moment, she spoke with the same calm certainty that had guided every decision inside the shop for years. "If he respected the people already waiting, I would welcome him inside and do my best to help him. If he believed money or influence placed him ahead of everyone else, I would ask him to wait his turn. My answer would be exactly the same, no matter who he was." William held her gaze for another few silent seconds before a genuine smile slowly appeared for the first time since they had met. It was not the smile of someone who had won an argument. It was the expression of a man who had finally confirmed something he had hoped was true. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and carefully unfolded a leather portfolio. Instead of placing it in front of Grace immediately, he opened it so she could see the first page. It contained a long-term tailoring agreement covering formal wear for charitable events, executive meetings, scholarship banquets, and community programs sponsored by organizations connected to his businesses. The projected workload stretched across several years. Grace quietly scanned the pages before looking up again. "This is more work than my shop can complete alone," she admitted honestly. William nodded with quiet approval. "That is exactly why I brought it here." Grace looked puzzled. He continued, "A person who knows her limits can be trusted to grow beyond them. A person who promises everything often delivers very little." He closed the portfolio and placed it gently into her hands. "Expand your team. Hire apprentices. Train young tailors who need an opportunity. Keep your standards exactly where they are. I am not investing in a building or a business. I am investing in the principles I witnessed yesterday." Through the front windows, the neighbors could only see William extending the portfolio toward Grace, but they could not hear his words. Their curiosity only deepened as Grace accepted it with both hands instead of rushing to celebrate. She looked down once more at the agreement, then quietly said, "If we work together, every customer who walks through this door will continue to be treated exactly the same." William answered without the slightest pause, "That is the only condition I was hoping you would never change." The agreement was signed without applause, without photographers, and without a single dramatic announcement. William Castellano simply offered his hand, and Grace Bennett accepted it with the quiet confidence that had guided every decision she had ever made inside her father's shop. The moment lasted only a few seconds, yet everyone watching through the front windows understood they had witnessed something far more valuable than an ordinary business transaction. William turned toward the men who had accompanied him that morning and gave another calm instruction. "Every future alteration, every formal suit, every ceremonial jacket, and every charitable event order comes here." His employees nodded without hesitation, carefully recording every detail before respectfully carrying the empty garment bags back toward their vehicles. No one rushed. No one celebrated. They behaved as though honoring a promise instead of closing a deal. Grace looked around her modest workshop, suddenly realizing how much life was about to change. Every cutting table would soon be filled. Every sewing machine would run from morning until evening. Every empty appointment slot that had worried her only hours earlier would disappear. Yet the thought that brought the greatest smile to her face had nothing to do with business. She imagined hiring young apprentices who had been searching for honest work, experienced tailors whose family shops had closed, and students eager to learn a craft that rewarded patience instead of shortcuts. Her father's dream had never been to build the largest tailoring company in Connecticut. It had been to build a place where skill and character mattered equally. Linda quietly wiped away a tear before laughing at herself. "I canceled my plans this weekend," she said. "It looks like we're going to be very busy." Grace smiled warmly. "Then we had better make room for more sewing tables." Outside, the whispers that had filled Main Street over the previous 24 hours slowly transformed into something entirely different. The same neighbors who had expected retaliation now watched truck after truck deliver bolts of fine wool, shelves, equipment, and workstations over the following weeks. Empty buildings nearby found new purpose as additional workspace was carefully restored without disturbing the charm of the historic neighborhood. Young people who had struggled to find meaningful employment began training under Grace's careful guidance, learning not only how to measure shoulders and shape jackets, but also why every customer deserved to be welcomed with the same respect. Word spread well beyond Hartford. Business owners traveled from neighboring towns because they had heard of a tailor who refused to treat wealth as a shortcut. Community organizations chose Bennett Tailoring because they admired the values stitched into every garment as much as the craftsmanship itself. Through it all, Grace never changed the handwritten sign beside the register. "Every suit begins with respect" remained exactly where her father had placed it years before. One crisp autumn afternoon, several months later, William quietly returned alone wearing the same navy overcoat. There were no security vehicles waiting outside, no assistants carrying schedules, and no announcement of his arrival. He entered the shop, took a numbered ticket from the small wooden dispenser near the entrance, and sat patiently beside a retired schoolteacher waiting for a coat fitting. Grace noticed him almost immediately, but continued helping the customer whose appointment had come first. William never objected. Instead, he smiled softly as he watched another ordinary afternoon unfold exactly as it always had. In that simple moment, everyone inside the shop understood the agreement between them had never truly been about suits, contracts, or success. It had always been about proving that genuine respect becomes even more valuable when no one is willing to make exceptions for power. Nearly 2 years passed, and Bennett Tailoring became known for something that could never be displayed in a storefront window. Visitors admired the craftsmanship, but they remembered the atmosphere even more. College graduates stood beside company executives in the same waiting area. Veterans shared coffee with young entrepreneurs. Retired teachers chatted with professional athletes. No reserved chairs appeared for important names, and no customer ever skipped ahead because of influence or wealth. Grace quietly insisted that the measuring tape never recognized social status, only the person standing in front of it. New apprentices often asked why every morning began with polishing the old wooden counter before touching a single suit. Grace would simply point toward the faded photograph of her father and remind them that the shop had never been built to impress powerful people. It had been built to honor ordinary ones. Those lessons spread beyond tailoring. Local business owners began adopting similar ideas inside their own stores. A neighborhood cafe removed its exclusive seating area. A nearby bookstore introduced community reading nights where everyone was welcomed without charge. Even the pharmacist across the street started a monthly program providing free consultations for senior citizens. Main Street slowly became known as a place where courtesy carried more influence than reputation. William Castellano continued visiting several times each year, always without ceremony. Every visit looked exactly the same. He entered quietly, collected a numbered ticket, greeted whoever happened to be waiting nearby, and patiently took his place in line. New employees who recognized him often rushed forward, eager to offer immediate service, but William always declined with the same polite answer. Someone else arrived first. Eventually, that sentence became almost as familiar inside the shop as the sound of sewing machines. One winter afternoon, a young apprentice asked Grace a question that had quietly puzzled everyone who knew the story. "Why do you think he trusted you after you refused him?" Grace looked toward the front window where snow drifted gently across the sidewalk before answering. "Because some people spend their entire lives wondering whether respect is real or simply another service that money can purchase. Sometimes the only honest answer is the one they do not expect to hear." Later that day, William returned to collect a finished charcoal suit. Grace handed him the garment personally, checking one final time that every stitch rested perfectly along the shoulders. He thanked her, then paused before walking toward the door. His eyes drifted to the framed photograph above the pressing station. "Your father left you more than a business," he said quietly. Grace smiled. "He left me a standard." William nodded with quiet admiration. "Then promise me one thing." "What is that?" He looked around the busy shop where apprentices measured jackets, customers laughed together, and sunlight reflected across polished wooden floors that had witnessed generations of honest work. "Do not ever let success convince this place to become different from the day I first walked through that door." Grace answered without hesitation. "As long as this sign hangs above the counter, everyone who enters will be treated exactly the same." William smiled, tipped his hat respectfully, and stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. The little brass bell rang softly behind him, just as it had on the day they first met. Across Main Street, people watched him leave without excitement because they had grown accustomed to seeing one of the city's most influential men waiting his turn like everyone else. The moment felt wonderfully ordinary, and perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Long after his car disappeared around the corner, the shop continued humming with conversation, laughter, and the quiet rhythm of careful hands shaping cloth into something lasting. In the end, the finest thing ever crafted inside Bennett Tailoring was never a custom suit. It was a community that remembered character always fits better than power, and on that quiet corner of Main Street, dignity never went out of style.